Now let's look at some of the revisionist perspectives and responses to these arguments. And the first piece that I want to look at is this response to these natural law arguments, which also is in many ways a response to the interpretation of Genesis 1 and 2 and the creation of man and woman as a separate dyadic unit. And I gave you some reading from Stephen Pope and from Jean Porter, who are both Catholic natural law ethicists, not necessarily conservative Catholic natural law ethicists, but Catholic natural law ethicists, who are writing a reflection and potential justification of homosexual unions from the natural law. And what a lot of this boils down to is the question of whether homosexual orientation is in fact a part of the normal distribution of human experience. In other words, it's not simply the result of some kind of damage, but there are some people who are, we have a spectrum of sexualities, and there are some people on that spectrum of sexualities who are born with homosexual orientation. And if that is the case, and if we also see that in other aspects of the created order, which in some ways we do. I mean, there are certainly research that shows there's same-sex activity between various other kinds of animals in certain kinds of context, not just in sort of highly stressed abnormal context, but that it does happen, and would not be fair to call that the same thing as we think of homosexual orientation in humans. But the suggestion is this is a part of human experience, and the natural law therefore doesn't necessarily condemn it. Scripture doesn't touch on it or deal with it in the creation stories, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it isn't part of human experience. So that's kind of the revisionist position on the natural law argumentation, if you accept a natural law framework at all. The text dealing with Sodom, Genesis 19, really not just the revisionist position, but I think many traditionalists about homosexual practice will acknowledge this as well, that text really has to do with a lack of hospitality and with pride, and not fundamentally with homosexuality. And if you look at Ezekiel 16:49, you'll see a later comment on that passage, which pretty clearly says that. So I think really not just the revisionists, but also the traditionalists who think carefully about Scripture, and we'll see in a moment Richard Hayes, an example of that, will agree that isn't really a key passage for our debate today about homosexuality. These other passages are. So what about the Levitical law? Well, what the revisionists will say is that if you look at the context of those passages, you will see that they're dealing with purity codes. They're dealing with some things that nobody would really consider a moral issue today, like whether you can engage in sexual activity when the wife is in her menstrual cycle. We probably wouldn't think of that today as really a moral issue. It's more sort of a practical issue or an issue of preference. Nevertheless, that's part of that code, and there are other things that are part of those purity codes that separate Israel from its neighbors. So the argument is that there are some practices that involved homosexual conduct, probably cultic practices in the nations surrounding Israel that they were being separated from. That's the revisionist perspective on those passages. In the New Testament passages, the question really revolves around the interpretation or the translation of the Greek terms that are used, and that, as we saw in the NASB, men who have sex with men, or the NIV, homosexual conduct, what words are being translated there. And so you have this word arsenokoitai and malakoi. So what do these two, and interestingly, two different words. Why two different words, and what do these words mean? Some of the revisionists will argue that the term that would have been more widely used in Hellenistic culture and Greek culture is paideraste for homosexual conduct. And why did Paul and the author of 1 Timothy not use paideraste? Why did they use these other unusual words? So, and in fact, arsenokoitai is a neologism. It's a word that's made up in the New Testament that doesn't appear anywhere else in Greek literature. So why make up a term and then use another term, malakoi? And this term malakoi means soft or fine. And interestingly, if you look at where else it's used in the New Testament, you can look at Matthew 11:8, and it's referring to fine clothes. Did you go out and see a man in fine clothes? It's not referring to homosexuality at all. It's referring to, at least arguably, it's not. It's referring to to something else, to this kind of flashy or showy or perhaps a certain kind of person in the culture. So why use those words? And the revisionist perspective is really these words are referring to something other than what we might think of as a committed relationship between people who recognize that they are of homosexual orientation. So the argument is that these words are not really referring to what is really a new phenomenon in our culture, which is the possibility of a committed, perhaps even lifelong and married union between people of the same sex. That it's referring to some other kind of conduct. And some of the suggestions for what it might refer to, and this is why the word paideraste comes up, is that there were practices of what we would today call child molestation, of really predatory male conduct of wealthier, more elite status males against young boys. In fact, there's even some literature talking about the fact that mothers who send their children out to tutors to learn, to school, send them out with bodyguards because they're worried that they're going to become assaulted by these men who are preying on young children. There's also arguments that these terms relate to some kind of cultic or temple prostitution or other kinds of male prostitution. So those are the arguments that are made. There isn't a whole lot of evidence one way or the other on a lot of these arguments. Again, arsenokoitai is a neologism. Malakoi is not a totally common term. There is evidence in the culture at the time, certainly, of violent and predatory practices. So that kind of argument suggests, maybe that's what these terms are talking about, and they're not really addressing something new that we have today. Romans 1 is perhaps in some ways a more difficult case for the revisionist position, not to suggest that trying to translate these terms or making the ethical judgment really rely on a very technical translation is easy, but Romans 1 ties the question to some kind of natural law and natural order thing, and a lot of the revisionist arguments here focus on, well, what exactly is Paul condemning? And the suggestion is that Paul is condemning people who are heterosexual, but who are acting against that nature, against the nature that they know is given to them, that are really acting with great promiscuity and lasciviously and just against what is given to them. and that it's not addressing the question of whether some segment of the population, which everyone agrees by the way, is even with all the science we have, is a relatively small segment of the population, that some segment of the population is naturally ordered toward homosexual tendencies, and that might have a natural way of expressing it. That just wasn't a possibility in Paul's day, and Paul is really assuming that all of these people are, that he's talking about, have a heterosexual orientation and are acting willfully against it. That also ties into the natural law arguments of people like Pope and Porter, who suggest that to the extent there is some natural homosexual tendency in some people, that's a different issue. So that's really the reformist case as to the scriptural passages into some of the natural law arguments. Other aspects of the reformist case have to do very broadly with, well, what do we make of Jesus' life and Jesus' ministry and teaching, the trajectory of Jesus' teaching for ethical reasoning? Do we only look at a few scripture passages here and there, or do we take those together into the whole context of Jesus' life and teaching and ministry, and we see again and again Jesus welcoming the sinner, Jesus kind of overturning expectations? And is that notion of radical welcome part of our ethical reasoning? And if it is, how does that relate to how we think about persons of homosexual orientation? Of course, they would acknowledge that Jesus often forgave sinners and told them not to sin anymore. But nevertheless, Jesus welcomed people. Jesus overturned expectations. Jesus brought in a kind of new order of things. A second piece of that relates to how the ethical thinking and practice of the New Testament church develops even in the book of Acts. And we'll point to the possibility and the experience within the church that God sometimes upsets settled expectations and settled views about what is right or good and does something new. And the paradigm text here is Acts 10, 1 through 11:18. And here, of course, is one of the central disputes and difficulties in the apostolic church and the first century church, which is how to deal with Gentiles who don't keep all the Jewish ritual purity laws. And as you read through this text, what you see is that, Peter was initially very opposed to really incorporating these Gentile believers into the Jewish Christian part of the church. And you have to understand at this time, church and synagogue are not really radically separate yet. In many ways, followers of Jesus are integrated as part of the Jewish community. So how do you accept Gentiles who don't keep the Jewish purity laws about what to eat and things like that? And Peter has a dream. Peter has a vision, has a dream. Peter sees all kinds of four-footed animals and crawling creatures, and a voice comes to him and says, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." Peter says, "By no means, Lord. I have never eaten anything unholy and unclean." Again, the voice comes to Peter and says, "What God has cleansed is no longer unholy." This happened 3 times, and then this blanket with these foods on it is taken up into the sky. Peter's confused about all this, goes back down. The upshot is Peter interprets this dream as God saying that at least for the Gentiles in the church, they don't need to keep all of the Jewish dietary laws. Now, we think of this perhaps as, well, okay, there were certain parts of the Old Testament law that were really ritual laws, and a lot of the laws about what to eat, you could eat and couldn't eat, were really about ritual purity. Maybe they had something to do with, kind of food safety in the ancient Near East, and they're not really moral. And then there's other parts of the Old Testament law that really have moral content that endures. And that's a pretty common way to understand some of this, but it really has nothing to do with the Torah as given to the people of Israel. There really is no distinction in the Torah between ritual and moral law. It is all the law. It is all the law given by God to his people. And so the fact that Peter is saying, well, I've had this dream and this stuff is no longer unclean, is really extraordinary. It is a really significant, major change and development. Indeed, if you look at Leviticus 11, you can see this long list of things that are clean and unclean and what they can and what they cannot eat. It's very detailed, and it's very much tied to the whole structure of the law. If you look at Deuteronomy 14:3, which is a text that, again, talks about what can be eaten and what can't be, it uses the same word, abomination, translated abomination in our Bibles, toiba, that is used in Leviticus 18:22 to say that a man sleeping with a man is an abomination. So, at least in some extent, a violation of the dietary laws would be an abomination. The same word that is used for a man sleeping with a man in Leviticus 18:22. And yet, in Acts 10 and 11, God gives Peter a dream and says, these things are no longer unclean. That, whatever position you take, that is a pretty extraordinary thing that we have to take into account from Scripture itself. Finally, there are some revisionists who argue that committed unions might be possible at least as an accommodation to our present condition as human beings. And here they will point to what really is, in many respects, the kind of negative attitude toward marriage as a whole, or at least ambiguous attitude toward marriage as a whole, in the New Testament. Jesus, of course, says that in the eschaton and the new heavens and new earth, in heaven, there will be no marriage. And then, Paul kind of has this wrestle throughout his letters with, is Jesus coming back soon? And how should we live in the interim? And Paul apparently was single and celibate at the time he wrote, and he often suggested, become like me, right? In other words, become single and celibate. You'll be better able to minister and to serve the kingdom. And indeed, here in 1 Corinthians 1:7, Paul says that he says, do not deprive each other in marriage of sexual activity except by mutual consent for a time. But he says, I say this as a concession, not as a command. I wish you were all as I am. In other words, celibate. But each of you has your own gift from God. Some have the gift of celibacy. Some don't have the gift of celibacy. And he goes on to say that it is better to marry than to burn. Burn with lust, right? So marriage here seems to be kind of an accommodation, even heterosexual marriage, which is certainly what Paul is assuming here. So is there a possibility that if some people have a homosexual orientation and they don't have the gift of celibacy, that at least marriage might be the next best step? Again, that's part of some of the revisionist arguments that are made.